The next group is financial incentives, and my colleague and friend Greg Bean led that group of students, and with no further remarks necessary, Greg, it's up to you. Okay? Thank you.
And based on learnings from this morning, I did bring printed slides just in case. So anyway, thank you, Chuck. Good afternoon. I'm Greg Bean. I'm with the Bauer College of Business here in the energy program at Bauer. And I want to summarize briefly the research work that a group of students did on the topic of financial incentives that could accelerate the energy transition. And so I'm really going to talk about three things. First of all, well, if we're talking about incentives, what are we actually trying to incentivize? Second, what's the broad spectrum of policy options generally that we might consider in Texas to accelerate this transition? And third, a kind of survey of what's been done in other jurisdictions, the U.S. federal government, other states, and other countries that we might consider. So with that, first of all, in terms of the scope of what did the students look at, and what are we trying to incentivize, really goes in kind of two buckets. The first was these three new low-carbon energy value chains that need to be built for us to get to a net zero emissions energy world. And we've touched on all of these already. We obviously need the carbon capture, use, and storage value chain, a low-carbon hydrogen value chain, and a low-carbon electricity value chain. So we have a need to have massive physical infrastructure investments made in these three value chains. But we also need to consider, when we're making such dramatic change to our energy industry, we need to think about the markets, okay? Are there some market development? Is there some market development that we need to incentivize? We're hearing increasing talk about how markets may start to evolve to take account of the carbon intensity of different energy products. So perhaps there's a way to incentivize that. All of the infrastructure that's associated with these new value chains, it's one thing to incentivize the building of the production facilities that we're talking about, the power generation facilities, the hydrogen production facilities, but we need the rest of the value chain and all the infrastructure associated with that to be actually able to use that. And then in some cases, it may be helpful and it may accelerate the change that we want to see by introducing new or expanding environmental or regulatory markets, things like low carbon fuel credits, renewable energy certificates, and things like that. So the students looked very broadly at all of these things and what could we do to incentivize them. And they came up with, on the next two slides, a number of big buckets. And so these are generic policy options that we ought to consider. And again, we really push the students to think very broadly. Don't start at the bottom and think of a few. Start at the top and think about all the things we could do, and then we can narrow it down from there. So we asked the students to look at all these different categories: regulations and standards, mandates, subsidies, externality pricing, capability support. We've talked a lot about that. We're going to have a workforce session later. There's potential policy options around incentivizing that. If we want, we can get punitive in terms of taxing things that we don't want. And then there are here's another set of things that we can do in terms of certifying the environmental impact of different products, creating these new environmental products that we talked about, reporting, requiring companies to report, changing market rules, and then thinking about stranded assets and liabilities. How do we deal with those? Potentially even how do we incentivize the repurposing of those? So that's the kind of general framework that the students used. I'm then going to go through examples of the policy options that the students researched to try to give us a sense of what's out there already. This is not all of the options that we could use, but there are some of the some of the ones that could have a big impact, and some of these we've already talked about. The Inflation Reduction Act, probably the single biggest piece of legislation that could help accelerate the transition that we've seen so far from the U.S. federal government, and several speakers have already talked about the impact of this in terms of increasing the existing 45Q tax credit. So clearly, that is something that we have at the state level, and is something that we could consider potentially at the federal level, that we could potentially consider at the state level. There are a couple of other federal policies that are in place around infrastructure and expanding existing programs to cover carbon capture, use, and storage. At the state level, there are some interesting policies that have been implemented. They tend to be smaller pieces, but some of them could be quite interesting for us here in Texas. Financial support of infrastructure, limitation on liabilities. We talked about the fact that as we start potentially injecting a lot of CO2, into the subsurface, we need to be very clear about who owns the liabilities associated with doing that. Some states have tax credit or tax deductions that they can that now apply to CCUS, and some states allow utilities, regulated utilities, to recover the costs associated with that. So that's CCUS. Second, hydrogen. And this is an area, as you could see, hydrogen at a federal level has had some level of support for over 20 years, and in some cases, maybe even going back a little bit to that. The first, going back to the Energy Policy Act and the Energy Independence and Security Act, a lot of that was federal government support of technology development, of R&D development, demonstration plants, and things like that. And of course, the DOE has a very substantial hydrogen research program, and they've recently kind of revamped that to try to get all the different, not just the DOE, but all the different government agencies aligned on where the federal research money is being spent. They've created this Hydrogen Shot Initiative, which is about funding demonstration plants. But really, in the last year or two, we've had the two big things that have come around that really could change the game for us in hydrogen. The first, as part of the Build Better Act, or the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, which set up the DOE's ability to fund the so-called hydrogen hubs. Many of us are involved in the development of those. Hydrogen hubs are being designed and proposed all around the U.S., and in an effort to attract some of that funding to potentially build a hydrogen hub, a network of producers and consumers all around the U.S. The Inflation Reduction Act, which we talked about, has many dimensions. We talked about the CCUS, or the carbon credit dimension, but it also has a very important credit for the production of clean hydrogen. And that is something that is going to really stimulate a lot of investment in lower carbon hydrogen production. And interestingly, it gets away from I think it was Chuck that talked about the different colors of hydrogen. It gets away from that and is very focused on the actual life cycle CO2 emissions of producing the hydrogen, okay? And the credit changes depending on the carbon intensity of that. And that's likely to be fairly significant. And obviously in hydrogen, if we're talking about hydrogen produced from fossil fuels, the higher 45Q tax credit will certainly help there as well. For hydrogen at the state level, California's been very aggressive on this, and I will note that these programs are not specific to hydrogen. They were not designed specifically for hydrogen, but they've had an impact on the development of the hydrogen economy or industry in California. The Clean Transportation Program, which collects funds from different vehicle and vessel registrations and various other things to fuel, fueling and charging infrastructure, R&D, support workforce and training and things like that. And then the low carbon fuel standard, which is maybe the kind of signature California program, which is designed to deal with especially with lower carbon transportation fuels. It does deal with lower carbon natural gas and incentivizes renewable natural gas. But a lot of it was to be focused on the non-stationary sources of emissions, and it defines fuels in terms of their carbon intensity relative to traditional fossil fuels, and you get credits if your fuel is less carbon intensive than the standard, and you get penalized if it's more than that, and it generates credits and deficits. And a lot of investment has gone into California based on these credits, some of which are very substantial. These are some other programs that California participates in. Targets for zero emission vehicles, that's done in conjunction with the other 9 states in that program. The zero emission transit bus requirement in California that by 2040 all transit agencies have to move to 100% zero emission bus fleets. That can be both hydrogen or electricity or any other zero emission type buses. And then the Clean Vehicle Rebate Program, which is a state program that kind of complements the federal program on lower carbon intensity light duty vehicles. Third, if we talk about low carbon electricity, the third value chain that we're trying to incentivize, and we just got finished talking about that with the last panel, again, the Inflation Reduction Act very importantly extends the existing wind energy production tax credit and the existing investment tax credit, solar investment tax credit. It extends those for a couple of years and reinstates them in one case. But more importantly, it potentially increases the magnitude significantly if other criteria are met around domestic wage and workforce requirements and things like that. So it could substantially increase the amounts of credits that are available. That is going to migrate, starting in 2025 at the federal level, to a technology-neutral clean energy production credit and investment tax credit. So at the moment, it's largely focused on wind and solar, but eventually will very shortly become technology neutral. Other things that will facilitate that is changes that provide alternatives to monetize those credits. One of the things that some renewable developers have struggled with is how do you actually monetize those credits? How do you transfer them? Is there a way to do it other than in the form of just a tax credit that you have to get? And then again, we talked about CCUS, which will obviously, higher credit would potentially impact low carbon electricity generation. At the state level, one of the big tools that's been used is the so-called renewable portfolio standards. We had one in Texas, which we achieved many, many years ago after about 5 elapsed years. Over 30 states have these right now. They're actually quite similar. They've really upgraded and migrated over time to where a typical target now is about 50% decarbonized power by 2040 and 100% by 2050. California is a little bit more aggressive. Their target is now 60% by 2030 and 100% by 2045. And they have in place, very clear rules about about compliance and calculations of those, and the authority to issue violations and issue penalties associated with that. The other thing that has done at the state level is carbon emission management, and the most prominent of those is California's Cap and Trade program, which was launched almost 10 years ago, which covers the big greenhouse gas emission emitters in the state. It has a built-in decline in the total allowable greenhouse gas emissions from those facilities, and allowances are a mix of free emission credits that are given to the emitting entities, as well as credits that are auctioned at quarterly auction. And one of the interesting things about this is those revenues are, because they generate net revenues, are actually produced into, or actually put into the state's greenhouse gas reduction fund. And one of the focuses of that, we were just talking about environmental justice and impact on lower income disadvantaged communities. A lot of that funding goes into projects that help those communities. They've also introduced what they call a strategic reserve. So in order to prevent very rapid rises in the cost of these allowances on a quarterly basis, the state keeps some reserves that they can issue at fixed cost levels to help moderate some of the short-term fluctuations with that. Again, some very interesting options to consider. Similarly, the EU has an emissions trading standard, which is focused on the same kind of big centralized emitters. In addition to that, Germany has a system that covers all of the emissions that are not covered by the European system. So that's an attempt to try to capture the emissions mainly from buildings and road transport. And then other countries have implemented just a fairly plain carbon tax, our Canadian friends being a notable example of that. So a lot of different options along the different value chains, different ways to incentivize different things. And that's really our summary, a wide variety of things, all different ways to do it. Some of the incentives can be very specific to incentivizing very specific investments and very specific value chains. Others, like those related to carbon pricing, carbon mandates, cap and trade, can affect almost all of the investments that potentially could be made. But I think it's important for us to remember that figuring out which ones are the best are going to depend to some extent on scenario development, what's the economic and technology development scenarios that we see going forward. Depending on how those evolve, some of the policy options might be a better fit in one scenario than in another. And then finally, of course, we need to tailor it for the situation that we have here in Texas. We're a highly industrialized state. We have a lot of existing infrastructure and resources that we can use. And so we need to make sure that we think about that as we look about all these other options, obviously potential impact versus cost and ease of implementation. So I think the message from the financial incentives team is there are a lot of options to thinking about what we could do, and we really ought to take a step back and think through those, look at those, eventually model some of those, and figure out which one of those we think is going to be the best, give us the best bang for the buck here in Texas. So that's a very brief summary of a lot of work that the students did. Okay.
Let me first introduce Dr. Norm Johnson. He's a colleague of mine in the business school here, in the Bauer Business School. And his expertise is in finance and supply chain and data analytics. And so he's somebody that I go to and ask questions about complex issues and get simple answers that usually baffle me. So with that, Norm, take it away.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. That's incredibly kind of you, Ramanan. And I'm very happy to have you all here and to hear from our experts. And I don't know if you've had a chance to look at their bio, and I fear that I might mangle a description of how capable these men are. So I'm going to go ahead and pass the mic over to Scott to just say a little bit about his background. And then Greg can probably say something about his background, and we'll get started on the questions. Scott?
All right. Well, I was listening to the past panel, and I'm part of this group that came from Exxon as well. Started off as a chemical engineer at Exxon, and then couldn't figure out what I wanted to do with my life, so I became a management consultant. And I kept on doing that for 35 years, and I still haven't found out what I want to do. But I spent most of my career working in the energy industry, spent 15 years working in Europe, and the rest of the time here have been involved a lot in the early days of trying to set up rate design and regulatory regimes in different parts of the world to try to make all this happen, and so I have some experience.
It's amazing how this Exxon thing goes around. I too started as an engineer at Exxon, and like Scott, moved into management consulting. I did that for 35 years, mainly around oil and gas, a lot of it outside of the U.S. And then leaving that, decided to try my hand at academia. So lest you have any concerns, I am in no way, shape, or form a qualified academic, okay? I'm just an industry hack that's resident in the land of academia, so that's my background. And my current job here is I'm in the Bauer College of Business, and I manage the energy program in the business school.
Thank you both. We've heard a fair amount of descriptions given about incentives and how a change is going to occur as a result of incentives. Can you just talk a little bit, either one of you could decide who wants to start, talk a little bit about why is it that financial incentives are probably going to dominate as the reason as to why transition will occur?
Well, when I was listening to Greg go through the long list, I was reminded a little bit around what some of the background theory was on why we need to have any kind of incentives. And there's so many categories of possible incentives. But I was reminded that when you listen to academics and policymakers talk, they want to sort through, what is the problem we're trying to solve? Why do we need incentives? And they're really relate to different kinds of market failures. If you think about the way our capitalist economy works, we're very focused on meeting the needs of our customers, and everything we do is spending money in terms of capital and setting up an organization to meet the needs of those customers. But sometimes the markets just fail to deliver on the full needs of society, and of course the environment is one of those big areas where the capitalist system kind of fails to operate. And so economists think through, well, what are the ways to kind of shift the incentives such that businesses in a marketplace will move toward solving environmental issues. And these are externalities that they calculate. And there's a whole kind of science around how do you calculate the cost of an environmental issue and that we need to fix. And I won't go into that, but there's a lot of work that gets done on that. But then it comes around and says, okay, now how do we solve that problem? And usually it gets down to, if you're a company trying to think of investment, you'd say, I need some money if you're going to ask me to do something different than what the customers want. So, I need some financial incentive. And listening to Greg, there's all kinds of elaborate schemes these kind of regulators have come up with to kind of find ways to give incentives. And maybe I can just talk about a couple of just of big ones that he went through. One of them is this notion of, and if you're an economist, you love this one, you say we want to create a price for carbon that will motivate the entire economy to kind of shift toward a low carbon world. And the two options that they come up with is a carbon tax or cap and trade, countrywide or even global tax on carbon. And economists love this one because it just puts a price on it, and then consumers will reduce their demand if it's too expensive, and industry will find ways to reduce the carbon in their product as a way to respond. And all you have to do is put a tax out there. Now there's a lot of political pushback on a tax, and so that hasn't made much progress, but that's one model. Then there's this cap and trade, which is a different approach. And Greg went through that a bit, where they put volume targets on it, and then if you can't meet your volume reduction, you have to pay a fee, and that implicitly creates an incentive to reduce your emissions. And then that's a way for a regulator to reduce the volume over time. So these are examples of different incentives to solve this core problem of from a business. Why would I make it a shift in my strategy? And what's interesting from my point of view, having watched all this kind of go back and forth over the years, and then watched what's come out of the IRA recently, we seem to have gone to a model that said it's too hard to put in these complicated cap and trade and these complicated carbon tax systems. people don't like these mandates, which lead to higher cost to customers. We'd like subsidies. And so what's happening is that with the IRA, there's this massive scheme to provide subsidies for just about every kind of opportunity area, and see what that's going to do to improve the overall reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. So I could ramble on, but let me just stop there.
Yeah, I think that Scott talked about, the need to overcome externalities that are not really, fairly priced in the market. It's clearly a huge driver, and particularly one that we're doing today. Sorry, that is a big driver for some of the action that we're seeing today around, lowering the carbon intensity of our energy industry. Another one is in terms of technology development. When we're looking for something, change as radical as moving our entire fossil fuel economy to net zero by 2050 in the next 30 years, that's really going to rely on tech to be even remotely economic in 30 years. That's going to require technologies that may exist in the embryonic form, but need to be developed and ultimate to the point where they can be scaled up and be commercially deployed. And that's another area where incentives often come into play. Particularly the federal government has in the past provided incentives around doing that. So how do you provide the kind of seed capital to take some of these breakthrough ideas that we're going to, and we're going to need some of them to eventually be deployed at a commercial scale, but how do you get them through what they call the valley of death in terms of innovation, ultimately to the point where the market systems can kind of take over?
You've given very broad description about incentives, and in those, that description is incredibly helpful. But can you talk a little bit about the efficacy of those incentives for the state of Texas in particular? And when I say efficacy, what I mean is, how efficient are they and how effective are they, the combination? If you were to choose among those incentives, what your thoughts would be as to what would fit Texas well?
All right, I'll start. I would say, and the last panel raised this, that with these incentives on the generation side for wind and solar, and one of Texas's advantages, which is that we can permit and site easily, there's going to be a huge tranche of capital coming to us because we're a part of the country where we can actually get things done. And the last panel talked a bit about the challenges that will create for the grid, because we need to make sure that we build the grid that can absorb all this power that's going to be put in place. So I think that's a good example of a highly efficient system. We've learned that you give developers incentives, tax credits on wind and solar, they will make those investments happen. If I were to switch for a second to carbon capture and storage, which is a more nascent one, and interesting to see how that will play out. One of the great benefits of IRA is, as Greg pointed out, is this huge tax credit, $85 a ton of carbon, to encourage investment in carbon capture and storage. So that solves the first problem, which is now if you're a business, you can say, oh, I can see how in some applications this could generate good returns. But then it opens up a whole nother tranche of issues. How are we going to get our Class 6 wells permitted? And we have to go through hoops with the federal government now and maybe state government down the road on that. How are we going to deal with long-term liabilities if carbon dioxide leaks in the system, and who's going to be accountable for that? We have different owners of the pore space. Is it surface owner? Is it going to be the mineral rights owner out there? So all of a sudden, a whole nother kind of set of legal regulatory issues. And this is where Texas really needs to act, in my view, in the next session to kind of clarify that, to enable us to make huge steps forward to make these investments in carbon capture and storage and achieve the decarbonization that we hope to achieve.
Yeah, I would agree. I think we have to take a step back and think about, what is it that's unique about Texas? that may be different. And clearly the potential impact of carbon capture, use, and storage. And therefore, to me, number one, that's got to be an area where we look at some state support, whether that is a 45Q plus, the state adds on to that, whether it's incentives around the infrastructure associated with transporting and storing the CO2, or whether it's just clarifications on things that Scott was talking about who owns pores and who's liable, things like that. To me, that has to be a big chunk. The second thing is hydrogen. I think, Houston is a place where it is natural for hydrogen to have a abnormally large role in our local energy system because of the nature of our system. And so we now have the IRA hydrogen production tax credits. It's not clear to me necessarily we'd need something additional in the production side at the state level, but there could very well be some things with respect to the infrastructure associated with that the state could do. And then finally, as we talked about in terms of low carbon electricity, clarifying that perhaps helping on the reliability or resilience side of that. What can we do from a policy perspective to kind of incentivize that part of it? Make sure we have adequate base load. Make sure we have adequate capacity to respond to all of the fluctuations that we need to in the electricity system.
I can add a couple of points that again, reflecting on the slides that Greg showed, what is happening in other states that has happened in Texas in the past and other areas that we might be able to apply here. I was thinking of your hydrogen. We've been willing as a state to give fairly generous property tax benefits to companies that will invest in certain areas. And I know several companies that are investing in hydrogen have already taken advantage of those and would like to take advantage of those again in the future. So that's one area in Texas where we could help. We also have a history of giving benefits on equipment, reducing the sales tax on equipment, and that can add another little bit of incentive, a little juice to encourage investment in Texas. So those are kinds of things, or at least we have a history of Texas of doing those kinds of things. We might be able to kind of ramp through our legislature.
Okay, so I primed the pump with a couple of pre-prepared questions, and now that the audience has been sending questions, and I'm going to take one from the audience for both of you. The question is, why does Texas put in low carbon fuel standard similarly to that of California, which is working? Why doesn't Texas do that?
The question is, why don't they?
Why doesn't Texas put in low carbon fuel standards the way it's done in California?
I mean, I personally think that it is something that we ought to look at. I haven't thought through the implications of that enough to think whether or not we need something that is that broad, as opposed to some of the more specific kinds of things we've talked about CO2 and the grid and hydrogen. I think we do need to think about things that address the non-stationary sources of emissions. And it's not clear to me at this point which of those, what kind of mechanisms is the best. I do think that is one that we could consider.
I think one of the problems with these mandates, like a low carbon fuel standards, if you require producers to meet a standard, it just raises the cost to the consumer, and particularly affects the middle class and low income consumers. So you create this, I'm going to be very anti-California here, this elitist group of folks who sit in the Capitol writing these legislations that result in very high costs for the average person who then moves to Texas. And we in Texas have had a view that we want to be more market-oriented, and we want to avoid things that are going to drive the cost of energy higher, which could affect a business or not. So and this is partly, I think, why we've kind of been settling, even at a federal level, of the subsidy route. Let's encourage investment that will lead to lower cost of energy and help the middle class absorb the benefits of that rather than having to pay extra cost.
I do think there's one interesting element of the low carbon fuel standard that could be interesting for Texas, and that really has more to do with characterizing the different fuels. I think making the life cycle carbon intensity of all the energy that we use transparent to consumers, I think would potentially drive a lot of behavior. Just understanding the differences in that and creating, a differentiated market. I do think that in the longer term, we are going to move from thinking about commodities, be they petroleum products, natural gas, or electricity, as being pure commodities to being differentiated on carbon intensity. And so I think, if nothing else, that's a piece of the low carbon fuel standard that we could import, just in terms of requiring companies that sell energy products to be able to tell the buyers of those what is the life cycle carbon intensity of that, so they can make those trade-offs themselves, even in a pure market environment.
Yeah, just triggers a thought. Which is, again, one of these market failures that we talk about is this failure of just lack of information. And energy efficiency has been one of those things where, the observation was consumers don't understand which product is more efficient than another, so if you label it, then they can make a better decision. And the same thing could apply to carbon intensity. If people actually knew what the life cycle carbon intensity, that might affect their decision making.
Great. It's funny you mentioned transparency over and over again, and the next question seems to pertain to that. The question from the audience is, how can different business industries be incentivized to disclose their carbon emissions and climate-related risks? Could this be mandated for publicly traded companies?
I'm sorry.
Could it be mandated for companies to disclose their carbon emissions and climate-related risk practices?
Absolutely. I mean, that we are moving towards that in different jurisdictions around the world. In the financial markets are increasingly asking publicly traded companies to provide much more detail on what they view as their business risk associated with different impacts of climate change. So I think that is also an area where you might over time see more and more investor preference for different companies. I think that is a possibility that's mandating the reporting, not necessarily any action.
Yeah, the big debate at the level of the SEC in the U.S. Going through this process of trying to define what should be reported, for individual companies, and huge debate around what do investors really need to know to make good investment decisions versus what information are they mandating just to drive down greenhouse gas emissions, which is beyond their brief. So there's a lot of debate around how far can the SEC go. But I think there's a general view amongst at least policymakers and activists that we need to have this information available such that society can know what the life cycle costs are of or life cycle content of greenhouse gas emissions in just about everything we do if we're going to solve this problem.
Yeah, and I think we can, use the analogy at more of a kind of facility or plant level of what we require in terms of plants disclosing other emissions that they make. Okay, be they of volatile organics or sulfur or nitrogen oxides or things like that, so that you can now as a resident of Texas, you have access to being able to understand what are the emissions associated with those individual plants in some cases, and I think more of that around carbon emission disclosure, greenhouse gas emission disclosure as well, methane emissions, things like that. I think we'll probably see more of that, and I think that could also incent some changes.
So you mentioned the SEC. In an ideal world, if you could define the role of the SEC in the development of ESG, how would you define that role? How would you describe that role?
Well, I have a view that should be limited to its brief of how do you protect investors and how do you ensure that an investor will have a full understanding of the risk from the climate embedded in that company, and that will usually mean as climate change kind of progresses, what are the physical risks to your asset structure? Are they located in places that are going to be adversely impacted by climate change in the future? And investors should be aware of that. And then there's this whole other area of what are the risks to your business of potential regulatory changes that could change the economics of your business model going forward. So keep it at that high level rather than getting into the detail that could be more of a police force to measure and monitor emissions from individual companies.
Yeah, I agree. I think some of our hobby colleagues could maybe talk a little bit more about that, but at the very high level, it seems like that authority exists, and it's just a question of kind of executing on that in the detail.
So the audience wants to get a slight shift in focus. Could you talk a little bit about the trade-off between utilization and risky storage of carbon dioxide? As far as, what should companies or in industry, what trade-offs should they make? Between the utilization and the risky storage of carbon dioxide.
Well, I'll start. Ideally, we would use as much of the CO2 as we can, but the practical reality is that the markets that we can see today are relatively small on it, and so it's hard to imagine, although maybe someone will come up with technologies that enable us to do it, but hard to imagine with what is out there today to see enough CO2 used to solve all our problems. And so we're going to need to store just huge quantities of it going forward. There is lots of work being done on how to use CO2 to make sustainable fuels, to make carbon products, that could be quite extraordinary in the future, but the volumes, at least in all the models I see, still turns out to be small, and we need to reduce so much of the emissions and even take CO2 out of the atmosphere, we're going to have to store big chunks of it in the ground.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, that would be ideal if we could, in relatively short order, come up with, some fairly economic uses for captured carbon. I think that will come, and whether it's, synthetic fuels based on green hydrogen and captured CO2, or whether it's other products that currently, or processes that currently require carbon, like cement and things like that. I think there's a lot of work being done on that, because clearly the incentive to have some revenue to go against the cost, especially if you were in a non-45Q world, would be significant. So I expect that to happen. I think it's hard to see that, as Scott said, having a major impact in the time frame we're talking about.
So this question is related to what we're doing here at U of H. You mentioned that many technologies are needed to overhaul the grid and move away from fossil fuels, and they're in the embryonic stage. Can you speak to ways UH Energy or others are engaging in oil and gas stakeholders to buy into this idea? What are some ways that we're trying to get people to buy into the idea of moving away from the grid from fossil fuels?
Away from fossil fuels.
Away from fossil fuels.
Well, I think a couple of things that we are, and I'll speak collectively for I'm in the business school, but I'll speak collectively for the university more broadly. One is, of course, things like this, and events, research that we do to try to make some contributions to the knowledge advancement in some of these critical areas, and then to disseminate that to people in the industry. That's clearly a big part of our role. Also, in terms of, we're going to talk later about the workforce development, but how we better prepare our students to understand the challenges of, a low carbon energy world, and hopefully get them excited about it as well. I think, as what we hope to be a fairly neutral setting, hopefully we can facilitate some of that. And then of course there is the basic research, funded research that we do in the different colleges and sciences and engineering and things like that to helpfully contribute some new, novel solutions, hard solutions, I would say.
Yeah, as I reflect on what U of H is doing, it's doing just an awful lot. On the topic of just reducing greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere, it has this a whole focus on energy broadly in the university, which I think captures 5,000 students in the Energy Club, for example, that are engaged in this dilemma of transitioning to a lower carbon economy, and engaging specifically in the challenges of how do we deal with the trifecta that others have talked about before, making sure we have low cost, accessible, and reliable and environmentally friendly sources of energy. And so I, as an outsider looking in, I think U of H has done a pretty fantastic job of having student engagement and then being engaged in the community and describing to the community what is needed on that.
There's one other thing that at least we're starting to do in the business school, and I'm sure it's happening in some of the other colleges as well, I may just be aware of it, is, we are also trying to broaden our focus beyond understanding and helping to mitigate the impacts or accelerate the transition locally and in the U.S., but increasingly try to get involved in the different challenges that exist in other parts of the world. For example, we have established with the Global Business School Network Sustainable Energy Learning Group. So we're one of 5 universities. It's one in Germany, one in Brazil, one in Australia, and one in South Africa, where we get together, we have joint events, and we kind of exchange ideas around what's happening in the different regions, because the challenges, and we have a specific bilateral partnership with the university in Johannesburg Business School, and the specific challenges that they have are very different than the challenges that we have. So increasingly, we're also trying to contribute to some of the more global issues, and we talk about accessibility and affordability. It's not just here. The big accessibility and affordability problems are in other places.
Just triggered a thought. Houston has a reputation as being a kind of an oil and gas center of the energy world, and we need to change that reputation to be viewed as the energy transition capital of the world. And I think U of H can play a big role in helping us transition toward that reputation through the technology it develops and through the students that it creates and goes into the marketplace and the research that it's done. It's going to be a long time to get our reputation shifted off that kind of hard oil and gas world, but I think if we do what we're talking about doing on carbon capture and storage and hydrogen and what's going on in across power in Texas, we can get there.
So the theme of this conference is Net Zero 2050 in Texas. It's a very ambitious thing to try to make such long-term predictions or to attempt to do that. People hesitate to do that all the time. Could you talk a little bit about how do you see transition occurring in the next 3 decades, 2030, 2040, and by 2050? So the nearer term ones, what do you see in the near term as far as transition solution goes to further out in time?
All right, well, I'll start off with a little bit of even a personal journey on this, which is when I started my career in the 1990s, we were talking about climate change, and all my clients' energy were talking about it and taking action. But at that time, global economic growth was slow, and we had a lot of time to kind of solve the problem. And then in the early 2000s, particularly with China just taking off, and coal plants being constructed in China at a very rapid rate, And by the way, as the other panelists mentioned, we were running out of gas in the US, so we were going to use coal. And so in the early 2000s, when I was at McKinsey, we ended up having a view that we were headed to a 5.5 degree centigrade world. And we had 60 gigatons of emissions by 2030, just a massive growth in emissions. And it was almost like we couldn't see how on earth we could actually make a shift. But the world was already kind of reacting. And we, the Mitchell saving us and U.S. with natural gas was part of a story around the world where gas played a much bigger role, and that reduced the amount of coal being used in power generation in the U.S., Europe, and elsewhere, and then renewables coming in. So now when we look at what's coming to 2030, we don't see 60 gigatons, we see something more like 30 gigatons. And I don't see a world of 5.5 degrees, it's more like 2.5. And that excludes innovation that might come. So back to your question, I kind of look at the next 10 years that we're going to be deploying as rapidly as we can renewables to help make progress. But I still think from a global level, it's going to take a long time to really kind of transition. I think we're going to see growing emissions. It's going to be very frustrating over the next decade before all this new technology comes in. But then I'm an optimist because I think that the pace of innovation that is going on and what we're doing in these hard-to-abate sectors like we've been talking about with carbon capture and storage will begin to get traction. In the period from 2030 to 2050, we'll see enormous improvements and the tide will shift and we'll see real reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. I don't think we're going to persuade the Russians to decarbonize, and so I'm not quite sure how far we're going to get to net zero globally. But I think we're going to make huge progress, and I think we'll be stunned at just how fast Texas gets there with the innovation that can take place here, and just as the last panelist articulated, just how fast things happen to Texas once we get our mind around it.
Yeah, to me, I mean, I think the 3-decade framework is kind of helpful. I mean, it's a long time to think about, but the way I think about it, what I expect to see in the next 10 years is, and what I would be looking for are a couple of things. One, are we starting to become clearer on the mix of technologies that are going to help us get there? I'm going to steal something from Ramanan, who says, anything that's going to have an impact in 2050, the science already exists today, okay? So, but there's a big difference between the science that we have that can help us and developing it and ultimately deploying it at enough scale to make a difference. So I think that a focus on a further refining of what the technologies are that are going to use the existing science that we have and that are the most deployable, I think we're going to see a lot of effort on that. And then on the flip side, I think we are going to see a lot more accelerated effort on the policy side. I think at different levels, federal level, state levels, different states, I think we're going to see policymakers spending more time and thinking about what the options are and what is it that specifically I can implement, and I'll say at the state level in my state, that can really help accelerate what goes on. So that the technology development, getting it to commercial economics and scalability, and then clarifying the policy side, to me, is going to be probably the focus in the next 10 years. And if we get that right, then I think it just becomes a question of execution going forward.
Okay, so sort of related to this forecast of what happens in the next 10 to 20 years, a question from the audience has to do with, can you comment on how do you think the transition will affect Texas's competitiveness globally in the years ahead? As we continue to make this transition, how would our competitiveness be relative to other states and parts of the world?
Personally, with respect to, I'll limit my comments to the energy industry, okay, as opposed to the economy more broadly. I think Texas could have a much better competitive position globally in a low and zero carbon world than we currently have in a fossil fuel world, because when you think about it, yes, we have abundant resources of fossil fuels, but we're not the lowest cost producer, okay? And so in a total fossil, in a fossil fuel world, the real rent goes to the low-cost producers in the Middle East and the Russians and people like that. If we get this right, okay, with all the technology that enables and all of the ability that we have to do things from a business perspective quickly and have reasonable regulations, I think personally we could be in a better position. I mean, it's very important for us to, energy exports are a huge part, and I'm thinking more of Houston and the Gulf Coast than anything else. Energy exports, whether you're talking about whatever replaces refined products, whatever crude oil, lower carbon natural gas, all the petrochemical products that we have, and making sure that those are as low a carbon intensity as we can. If we get that right, we could have a much stronger competitive position in the energy and related fields, I think.
Yeah, and I'll build on that again with this IRA, with the subsidies that will be coming from that. If we can get all the permitting and regulatory stuff sorted, big if. It just creates a huge impetus, just to build on what Greg was saying, is that we are in a position through what we can use through electrification to reduce emissions in our petrochemical refining complex. And then with carbon capture and storage, we could be the first major center where we have really decarbonized that entire area, which opens up the world for exports, because we can be the low carbon exporter of all these chemical and refined products. And if we just take hydrogen as a specific example, and that's both the hydrogen using steam reforming, the blue hydrogen, and the green hydrogen using electrolysis. Again, with these huge subsidies we have with IRA, we could end up becoming a major exporter of ammonia to Japan, to Europe. We will be the low-cost provider, given our ample wind and solar resources on the electrolysis side and our huge source of CO2 we have from the petrochemicals refining side. And that could lead to a real advantage. We did some analysis and said, we would compare to Australia, parts of the Middle East, Chile, where we are amongst the lowest cost places in the world with this hydrogen side. And with the subsidy, boy, we're ready to go.
Yeah, and I know we're going to talk about workforce later, but when you look at from a skills per knowledge perspective, what's going to be required, there's no place that has the concentration of skills that we have. There's a reason why, the wind companies all set up big operations here in Houston, okay? Because they needed a lot of the skills in terms of engineering, project development, project management, supply chain skills that exist here and were reasonably transportable. And I think that's true in a lot of the skill sets that are currently deployed in the fossil fuel industry. So that's one of the reasons why I'm really quite optimistic. I think we have the skill sets. I think we have the kind of government framework and just the general business culture that I think could really move us, even to be more competitive than we are today.
Interestingly, so one of the questions from the audience is a slight switch in focus. It says, will nuclear power become a larger player in Texas? What are your thoughts?
Well, on nuclear, as part of McKinsey, we would always do these forecasts on global energy and nuclear power, and I've been doing them for 35 years. And for 35 years, I've been very bullish on nuclear, and for 35 years, I've been wrong on nuclear. So I'm still bullish on nuclear, because I still can't see a world when we can operate without it, but I'm humbled by how wrong I've been for 35 years in a row.
Yeah, I don't really have much to add in this space, other than I think it's important that people recognize that we have to make some progress in nuclear, even if it's just to make sure that we extend the lives of the plants we've got, okay? What we can't have is a reduction in baseload nuclear power in the next 20 or 30 years. And that's going to be, fairly significant. It's a significant effort. It's not necessarily a huge cost relative to building new plants, but the first order of business, I think, in nuclear is making sure the plants that are running today that have the ability to be running in 30 years are. The question of new plants and new technologies is really kind of out of my league.
So the Inflation Reduction Act provides a bunch of incentives for companies to get involved in energy transition. A question from the audience is, how can hydrogen carbon-related business still be attractive with or without those incentives? How can the hydrogen carbon business still be attractive with or without incentives from the IRA, from the Inflation Reduction Act? So I guess the questioner wants to know probably how much do you think the Inflation Reduction Act will move the incentive for hydrocarbon investments?
Okay, so, for hydrocarbon.
Right.
Hydrocarbons.
Well, I'll put it this way, which is that the oil markets will be a global market, and the gas markets will have a mix of region plus the LNG global market. And the U.S. gas markets will be connected, at least indirectly, to the global markets. So I still think what's going to drive our hydrocarbon activity in Texas will be these global markets for oil and gas. And we can see how oil demand will decline over time. If you believe in most forecasts, then our cost competitiveness of oil production in Texas will have to meet that demand, but we were so good at innovation. I'm optimistic we'll continue to innovate to meet global demand for decades ahead. And then on the gas side, I think we have a huge opportunity given the enormous demand for gas to complement power from renewable power around the world, that we can be a huge provider for natural gas to the world for a long time. So I would be quite bullish on hydrocarbons continuing to play a role. The big however would be, if you think about it in terms of jobs and employment, I think there would be smaller numbers in the decades ahead than what we've had in the past, because we're going to keep getting more and more efficient, and the demand growth overall will not be huge. So this is why we need the energy transition type investment to kind of continue to grow here in Houston.
I think there's still going to be significant opportunities to make good investments, profitable investments in gas, and to maybe a slightly lesser extent in oil, as long as companies are focused on, in addition to, I think cost is going to become increasingly more important, because I think that, the levels of rent are going to decline over time. And so, marginal cost of production, I think, are going to become more important on the oil side. And the other thing is carbon intensity. If you think about, if oil demand declines, as a lot of people think it will, the smaller level of oil demand that's going to be available in 2050 is going to go to the people that are, the producers that have the best combination of lowest cost and lowest carbon intensity, I think. I think in gas, the same thing, but the gas market is going to be bigger, and so there'll be a little bit more opportunity. I think it changes the way you think about investing in hydrocarbons, in my opinion, that you focus more on, okay, if I'm going to be, we're not going to be in an increase in a, we've all grown up in an environment, and really the history of the oil and gas industry has been constant growth, okay? Global population has grown, energy consumption goes with that. It does change the dynamic, but there's still going to be opportunities for people to make profitable investments in both oil and gas if they're focused on the intensity part of it, because I think that's going to come into play.
I'll just add a little bit on I think that's a good point, because when you think about long-term investments in oil, it's one thing with investments in oil that are short term, but if you think about infrastructure, it's going to take 10, 20 years to pay off. You then are going to be in a world where the demand is much, much lower. You're going to be competing with very low-cost producers in the Middle East. You know, you can imagine oil prices being in the $20 to $30 range. So you're going to be very, very efficient in order to compete in the very long term. Whereas gas, you can say that the demand for gas won't peak until much later, and the world's going to need U.S. LNG as the marginal source of supply, so we ought to be able to continue to take advantage of that for a few decades.
So between both of you, you have more than 5 decades of work experience when I add the numbers. And I'm not at all aging you, just a matter of respect for your experience. So you've certainly probably observed some best practices through the years that are done in Texas in terms of value chain, best practices that contribute to positive outcomes in value chains, right? Can you talk to us a little bit about what are some best practices that can be replicated from the past to benefit energy transition going forward in the future? That is unique to Texas from your experience.
One thing I think we're going to increasingly see, and is something that's going to be very important in Texas, if you think about, we talked earlier about how the U.S. went from a world of believing we were going to need natural gas imports to now becoming one of the world's largest natural LNG exporters. That became about because as the situation changed, people in the industry realized it, and also realized that we had infrastructure and assets that could be repurposed. And I think one of the best practices that we are going to need to focus on and look more on, particularly here in Texas, is how do we repurpose some of these fossil fuel assets that we have? There's a lot of, I have a group of students working this semester on looking at that, and what are all the fossil fuel assets around the world. There are some different ideas about how they might be used in a more low carbon way, and I think that's going to be a best practice, and we have some experience at that. We know how to shift gears. We know how to, we've dealt with commodity cycles forever, so we know how to ramp up investment, ramp down investment, be prudent, how to make large lead time capital investments in an uncertain environment. So I think those are a couple of things that will bode well for us.
Yeah, a similar view, which when you think about companies that have been successful, it's been in both categories. There are some companies that have just been brilliant at understanding where the industry is going over the long term, making these enormous capital investments across the value chain in the lowest cost. I'm thinking of Exxon, and they put these assets in place, and they're there for forever. And we're all amazed at how they're able to generate attractive returns to shareholders and continue to provide safe, reliable sources of energy. And then there's this other part, just incredibly nimble, agile part of Texas and Houston, where the market changes and we quickly shift our direction. We go from importing LNG to exporting LNG in a way. We invent this new thing called horizontal drilling and hydraulic fracturing that leads to the shale revolution, and all of a sudden the world changes in a way. And then we go from small petrochemical investments, just a staggering investment over the past decade to take advantage of that, shale, ethane, and that's what they're doing. So we've been unbelievably nimble to respond to these things. And I think that's just a core benefit of Texas. And I spent a lot of time working in Europe, and you just see how slow things are in other parts of the world compared to just the rapid pace of innovation and shifting the value chain that happens here.
Okay, so that's very helpful. But to sort of close the loop on best practices going forward, can you talk about, are there any best practices from outside of Texas that you think are fit for Texas and in an ideal world would be great as we go through energy transition?
Well, we hate government in Texas. and there could be just an opportunity for government to play just a little bit bigger role in some things, you know, in a way. So there is a notion of going from no government to limited government. So let's put it that way. And I'll just say, you know, the rules on getting put, you know, we set up our deregulated, you know, power system, you know, 20 years ago, and then kind of kept it that way until it now is broken and we need to fix it. You know, how can we have more thought leadership in the government, perpetually watching this, you know, system as it evolves, and then intervening in a way that makes the market system work rather than waiting until we have a train wreck.
Yeah, I agree. I think in the policy side, you know, there are so many different levers that we can pull. And I think the levers that make the most sense in Europe are probably not the same levers that make the most sense in Texas. I think but maybe elements of what people are doing in different countries might, or in different regions might work. I think, and I agree with Scott, I think that the staggering nature of what it would take to move us to net zero in 30 years is going to require some more government involvement than we have traditionally had. That doesn't mean we have to move to a European style system, but we're probably going to need a little bit more. And I think the real trick for us is to figure out what is that? What are the best small things that we can do that can have a really big, you know, in the policy side in the state, that can have a really big impact, and hopefully will help contribute to that debate.
So earlier on, I attempted to divvy up the 2050 future in decades. Someone in the audience asked, is the increase in renewable energy production in Texas going to be enough in the next 5 years to cover shortfall from coal and natural gas plants going offline? What are your thoughts?
I don't know if I have a real view, but maybe I'll just give a bullish view, which is the subsidies coming from IRA are so huge, and we're so open for business in Texas. I think there's going to be a massive investment in wind and solar that's going to surprise all of us, like it did, 20 years ago when it first came in. And we'll blow out our grid, and we'll have no pricing mess. So that's kind of, we won't get the grid, the transmission built fast enough. So.
I think that I was just going to say the previous panel, you know, was really focused on it. It's not my concern would not be the generation assets. It would be, can we keep the grid up with the transmission and other things that we're going to need? That to me is the big question, and that may very well be one of those areas where a little bit of more light touch from the state might help. We seem to do a very good job in terms of interconnection compared to a lot of the competing ISOs in terms of the way we socialize the cost of doing that, and hence that tends to speed up the process. So there may be a few other things that we can do, you know, on the grid side of things that really could help.
So we've talked a lot about incentives and federal support and mandates and policies, et cetera. And probably we're going to jump into the domain of what another session will cover, but it's still worth mentioning here. Can you talk a little bit about what do you think the workforce is going to need to look like for successful energy transition in the next 3 decades? Can you just broadly speak about what kind of transition the workforce have to undergo?
Well, and Greg started this, but when we look a little bit at the skill requirements, for the future, and 90% of the skills are actually quite similar on a functional basis. We're going to need project management that you could have done for oil and gas, for energy transition related technologies. We're going to need frontline operation skills, welders, maintenance operators. So a lot of kind of common skills that will be required. I think the area that turns out to be the biggest differences would be, one is we think we're going to need far more entrepreneurship, innovation-oriented capability than we've had in the past, and this is focused mainly on Houston. We've built this great oil and gas kind of capability with, I'd say, a certain type of entrepreneurship that worked for the oil and gas industry. But we're going to need to have a new type of business creation that will enable us to kind of create businesses in a startup sense that will enable us to build the energy transition companies of the future. So I think that'll be a difference. And I think we're going to need fewer capabilities in some of the areas that have been big sources of employment in like petroleum engineering. Sorry for petroleum engineers out there, but in the future versus the past.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think we do have 90% of what we need, whether it's the different technical aspects, the project development aspects, the commercial side of it. We have all that stuff here, and I agree. I think the one thing and we're already starting to see this come up, being developed here in Houston, is on the entrepreneurship side. I think, our energy system 30 years from now is going to be a lot more decentralized than the system we have today. The system the fossil fuel system is based on economies of scale. So people have been focused on, all the things that you do to capture economies of scale in building big things, okay? I think this energy system is going to shift to be a lot more decentralized, and I think that's going to require a lot more different solutions and a lot more entrepreneurship, I think, than we've traditionally had in the past, which I think is great. And we're trying to get ahead of that, at the university and having more entrepreneurship and energy classes, which a lot of students are interested in, to think about, okay, there's going to be there may not be mega scale things that we need to develop and invest in, but because it's going to be more decentralized, whether it's microgrids or anything else, there may be a lot more entrepreneurial opportunities than we've traditionally had in the fossil fuel industry. So I think that's something we really need to focus on. But we'll let the workforce people worry about that.
Right. Before I thank you, I'd like to give you the remaining 2 minutes, each of you 1 minute, to just sum up in your mind what are the key takeaways as far as financial incentives and the move towards energy transition. In 1 minute, what would you say are a few things to keep in mind?
Well, I would say that we've experimented globally in the U.S. with many kinds of incentives, and we seem to be heading toward this incentive model, which is all about subsidies, providing subsidies to individual types of technologies to enable us to encourage businesses to invest in those. And I think that can work. These kind of mandates or penalties leads to lots of conflict and pushback. And instead, if we go toward, we'll give you lots of money to do what you want to do, everybody's happy.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, my takeaways are, number one, there are a lot of different things we can do, okay? And I think that, while the path of the federal government is pretty clear on subsidies through tax credits for a variety of reasons, one of the reasons is that they're one of the easiest things to do politically. I think there are opportunities to do some other things, and I agree, they probably don't involve mandates or necessarily regulation, but maybe some other more innovative things that we can do at the state level that can kind of help get us there. And my takeaway is I think it's worth spending a little bit of time at the state level thinking about maybe some of the things that are not kind of top of mind and very obvious, just to make sure we're not missing something that would be really effective and really good fit here.
Well, thank you so much, gentlemen. I'd ask the audience to join me in an applauding Scott and Greg.
Thank you, Norm, for moderating an awesome panel there. Thanks, Scott. Thanks, Greg, for a fantastic panel.